The morning of my father's funeral in Boston was grey and bitterly cold. A November rain beat down against the stained glass of Holy Trinity, the old church where he'd once sung in the choir as a kid. I stood by his casket, tired, shivering, barely holding it together, while friends and distant relatives lined up to murmur words of sympathy. In the chaos of umbrellas and wet coats, my Uncle Frank found me, moving with the confidence of a man used to taking charge. Frank always wore the same sly smile, as if every family gathering was a game of chess only he could win. He put a hand on my shoulder, gentle but somehow performative, and leaned in so only I could hear. "Alison, can we have a word in private about your father's affairs?" I nodded numbly, letting him guide me away from the crowd and into a side chapel. Inside, my cousins Nick and Amanda were waiting. Nick looked every bit the Ivy League grad, posture perfect in a charcoal suit, his phone in one hand and the other in his pocket. Amanda, always immaculately dressed, clutched a stack of tissues she didn't seem to need. Next to them stood a thin, grey-haired man in a rumpled suit, Mr. Rose, their family lawyer, whom I barely knew. Frank cleared his throat and surveyed the empty room, as if making sure no one would overhear. He shifted into a tone that was both patronizing and oddly rehearsed. "Alison, I know this isn't the best timing," he said, "but we really need to discuss the will. Your father made some significant changes in his last months." My stomach clenched. I'd seen the signs: family meetings held without me, the sudden hush when I entered a room, the closed doors at Thanksgiving. None of it was a surprise. What kind of changes? I managed, though I already suspected the answer. Frank's lips twitched. "Well, your father grew concerned about your lifestyle choices. 31 and still unmarried, no kids, living in that cramped apartment in Cambridge, working at a non-profit," he let the implication hang. Amanda picked up the thread with an unconvincing softness. "Dad and Uncle Frank talked a lot about what it takes to run a family business. We all agreed that handling green tech, the investments, the Newport house. It's a massive responsibility. Business experience matters, Alison. Good intentions aren't enough." Nick nodded, a picture of solemnity. Managing millions isn't something you learn working at a shelter. The lawyer, Mr. Rose, stepped forward. "Miss Green, I'm afraid your father's latest will exclude you from inheriting the estate. All assets, real estate, the company, investments, and the main cabin will pass to Nick and Amanda. Your father's intent was clear." He opened a manila folder and showed me the will. My father's signature was there, but it was weak, shaky, evidence of how frail he'd become after months of heavy medication. I swallowed hard, barely trusting my own voice. "When was this will prepared?" "July 15th, and Mr. Rose replied. Your father called my office himself, said he wanted to make some urgent changes for the good of the family." Frank put on an expression meant to seem empathetic but came off as smug. "Alison, your father loved you, but he was thinking of the business. Nick has an MBA from MIT. Amanda's got her finance degree from Columbia. They're ready for this." Amanda chimed in, "It's not about being cruel. It's about protecting what your dad built." There it was. The verdict I'd sensed coming for months but still felt like a slap. The message was clear: I was the family disappointment, unfit to inherit. They expected me to crumble, to thank them for offering scraps from the table. But I didn't flinch. I simply nodded and pulled out my phone, as if I'd just remembered something important. "If you'll excuse me," I said quietly, I need to make a call." I stepped away to the back of the chapel, pretending to dial. My heart hammered, but my mind was crystal clear. These people had written me off. What they didn't know was that I'd spent the last 5 years working beside my father, running late-night audits, meeting vendors, researching competitors, quietly becoming the only person he truly relied on. No one had seen the emails that sent me during his last hospital stays, or the quiet conversations we'd had about legacy, about purpose. No one knew about the trust. As I pressed my phone to my ear, my mind raced with memories, driving Dad to appointments, sleeping in a hospital chair, listening to him recount every hard lesson he'd learned at building green tech from nothing. He never once said he doubted me. In fact, his last words to me, words I'd never share with this crowd, were, "You're the only one I trust with everything." I hung up, slipped my phone back into my purse, and rejoined the group. I kept my face blank, but inside, something fierce was building, a resolve I hadn't felt since I was a kid, the scrappy determination that always said he admired most. Frank was watching me, waiting for me to break. Instead, I met his gaze and smiled, just a little. "Thank you for letting me know," I said. "Is that all?" For a moment, they looked stunned. Maybe, for the first time, they realized I wasn't the weak link after all. After the reading of the will, the family drifted out into the rain-soaked city streets, already talking among themselves about what would happen to the business, the house in Newport, and all the other trappings of our family's legacy. I lingered behind in the chapel, hands shaking as I gathered my coat, a million emotions warring inside me. Humiliation was there, yes, but something else too, a spark of anger, and a sharp clarity about what needed to come next. For weeks, life seemed to blur into a pattern of silent, determined work. I returned to my apartment in Cambridge, a cramped walk-up filled with battered books and hammer-down furniture, and threw myself into my job at Haven Bridge, the non-profit homeless centre where I'd been working for years. My days were long and unspectacular, answering emails, organising meal shifts, writing grants late into the night while rain tapped against the window. Outwardly, nothing changed. I didn't complain to anyone, not even my best friend Taylor. In the world's eyes, I was the same unambitious Alison, 31, single, living on takeout and coffee, trudging through city slush with thrift store boots and too many worries. People at Haven Bridge saw me as a reliable, hard-working manager, the kind of person who quietly took care of the details nobody else noticed. But what no one else saw, not even Taylor, was that every spare minute at home I poured into something much bigger than myself. In the evenings, when the centre was quiet and the streets outside were empty, I opened my laptop and dove into spreadsheets, legal docs, and emails from Dad's old advisors. There were so many questions to answer. Was the trust valid? Could the will really override it? Was there anything I'd missed in the labyrinth of family finances that had quietly taught me to navigate over the years? I met with Marcus, my father's longtime estate planner, in a nondescript office above a deli in Back Bay. Marcus was a small, brisk man in his late 50s who wore the same navy sweater every time we met. He slid a thick folder across his cluttered desk and said, "Your father was thorough. The Green Family Trust is airtight. You're the sole trustee and beneficiary, as of 5 years ago." I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. Marcus gave me a sympathetic look. "Your cousins can contest, but they won't get far. The trust holds everything: business assets, real estate, investments. When your dad got sick, he wanted to make sure no one could challenge your right to manage it all." I nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. I knew how much Dad had agonized over the decision, worried about dividing the family. What about the will? It only covers what was left outside the trust at the time of death. As far as I can tell, that's not much. A couple thousand in a checking account, an old Subaru. The rest was already secured. Over the following weeks, I kept my routine as ordinary as possible. I worked long hours at Haven Bridge, taking on extra shifts, organizing a holiday fundraiser, writing a speech for a city council meeting about affordable housing. The staff noticed my focus, but no one suspected what I was handling in my orphars. At home, I spent evenings going through old emails and files Dad had given me, notes about the company's challenges, lists of employees he considered family, even private journal entries about his hopes for my future. I remembered nights sitting in his hospital room, him pressing my hand and whispering, "You know what matters, Ali. Don't let them tell you otherwise." Taylor, always quick to notice a mood shift, asked me over cheap takeout one night, "Are you okay, oh? You seem, I dunno, tougher lately." I shrugged. Just tired. Lot going on at work. She grinned. You, tired? You're like the Energizer Bunny with a coffee addiction. If you ever start a business, I'll be your first customer. I laughed, but inside, the idea struck a chord. It wasn't lost on me that every skill I'd honed running Haven Bridge, balancing budgets, mediating conflicts, building teams, was exactly what Dad had done building green tech. He used to say, "A non-profit work is business with a soul. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Meanwhile, the family chatter started trickling in. Amanda sent me a perfunctory email about hoping I was coping okay and included an awkward offer. When we get everything sorted, we could maybe set up a small trust for you, just to help out with living expenses. Nick texted, "I hope there are no hard feelings. Family takes care of family." I didn't reply. I was busy taking care of the legacy Dad actually left behind, one they'd all underestimated. One night in December, I found myself walking past the Green Tech building, the lights still glowing late into the night. I stood on the sidewalk, hands deep in my coat pockets, watching as the security guard inside mopped the marble floor. That building had been my playground as a child and my training ground as a young adult. I thought of the people whose jobs depended on green tech, their mortgages, their kids' college funds, their retirements. I whispered into the darkness, "I won't let you down, Dad." The next morning, I put on my oldest boots and went back to work, at Haven Bridge, and quietly, steadily, on something far bigger. January in Boston brings a cold that creeps into your bones and won't let go. At Haven Bridge, the heat barely kept up, and every day more people showed up at our doors seeking shelter. I buried myself in work, pushing aside the family drama, losing myself in spreadsheets, grant deadlines, and city reports. From the outside, nothing about my life looked remarkable. I took the tea to work, lived on coffee and microwaved soup, and sometimes fell asleep at my desk, the glow of my laptop the last thing I saw before I drifted off. But inside, everything was changing. Quietly, without fanfare, I was putting together the next phase of my father's legacy, one he'd entrusted to me alone. In the rare moments I paused, I thought about what my family believed about me. Nick and Amanda, convinced they'd outmaneuvered me, seemed more smug than ever. Uncle Frank called only once, to remind me, not unkindly, that there would always be a place for me if I needed anything. I said thank you, meaning none of it. Because while they patted themselves on the back for taking care of family, I was finalizing something bigger than any of them suspected. The city was still hungover from the holidays when Marcus, my father's trusted advisor, called me into his office again. "Ali, it's time," he said, sliding a thick stack of papers across his desk. "All assets in the Green Family Trust can now be moved at your discretion. What would you like to do?" My mind raced through late-night conversations with Dad, his hopes for making a difference, his belief that wealth was only valuable if it could change lives. I knew exactly what I wanted. "Transfer everything to the Allison Green Community Foundation," I said, my voice steady even as my heart thudded in my chest. "All of it, the company, the real estate, the investments. I want the foundation to control the assets." That's what Dad wanted. Marcus looked up, eyebrows raised. "That's a bold move, Allison. Once it's done, it can't be undone." I nodded. "That's the point." He gave me a small, proud smile. "You're your father's daughter." The transaction took less than an hour. By the time I walked back out onto Boylston Street, nothing about Boston had changed. The same grey slush on the sidewalk, the same rush of traffic, but my entire life had shifted. For 2 weeks, I said nothing to my family. I worked my regular shifts, helped Taylor organize our annual cold weather drive, attended city meetings and drafted proposals. Each day, I felt lighter, as if some invisible burden was finally lifting. But news travels fast in families, especially when there's money at stake. I was in the middle of a staff meeting at Haven Bridge when my phone buzzed with a call from Amanda. I let it go to voicemail. 3 minutes later, Nick called. By the time I finished my shift, there were 12 missed calls and a dozen texts, all variations of the same message: "Call us. It's urgent." That night, I walked home through the bitter wind, feeling a strange sense of peace. I didn't owe them anything, not an explanation, not an apology. Dad had trusted me to do the right thing, and I had. Still, I braced myself for what was coming. The next afternoon, the storm hit. Amanda, Nick, Uncle Frank, and Mr. Rose requested a family meeting at Frank's townhouse in Beacon Hill. I arrived to find the room buzzing with nervous energy, the air thick with anticipation and accusation. Frank started gently. "Allison, we're a little confused. It seems the Green Family Trust's assets have been transferred to a charitable foundation under your control." Amanda couldn't hold back. "Why would you do that? Those assets belong to the family. To us. Dad left everything to Nick and me." Nick's voice was tight, his face pale. "Do you even realize what you've done? Green Tech, the new port house, the investments, you just gave all that away?" I looked at them, not with anger but with a quiet confidence I hadn't known I possessed before all this. "No." I followed Dad's wishes. He didn't want the company or his legacy turned into a trophy. He wanted it to serve the community, to mean something real. That's what the foundation is for. Mr. Rose, the lawyer, shuffled his papers and looked at me over his glasses. "The will states the estate goes to Nick and Amanda. Are you prepared for a legal challenge?" I didn't flinch. The will only covers what Dad personally owned at the time of his death, which, as far as I know, was a used Subaru and about $2,000 in his personal account. The trust, everything else, was transferred long before he passed, legally and with full capacity. I have the documents if you want to see them. Frank tried to soften his tone. Alison, be reasonable. We're family. Surely there's a way to work something out. I shook my head, feeling a surge of strength. For years, I was left out of meetings, ignored at family dinners, written off as a failure. You all made assumptions about my abilities, my intentions, even my character. But Dad saw what you didn't. He saw the work I put in, the nights I stayed at the hospital, the weekends I spent helping him manage the business. This was his choice, and now it's mine to honor it. Amanda's voice cracked, a mix of disbelief and desperation. So, what? We get nothing? I looked her in the eye, my voice calm. You get exactly what Dad intended. You get the opportunity to do real work, if you want it. The foundation needs good people, people who care about more than just money. That's the only inheritance available now. The room was silent, stunned. For the first time in my life, I realized I held the power, not out of spite, but out of respect for the legacy Dad had truly wanted. The family meeting in Uncle Frank's elegant townhouse ended in stunned, uncomfortable silence. I left first, walking down Beacon Hill's icy cobblestone streets, my boots crunching through old snow, feeling oddly light. For years, I'd felt invisible at family gatherings, someone to be pitied, gently ignored, or at best, tolerated. But now, I was the only one who truly understood the legacy Dad meant to leave. That night, I lay awake replaying the meeting in my mind. I was exhausted but strangely exhilarated, as if a burden had been lifted. Still, there was no sense of triumph, just relief and a deep, bittersweet sadness for everything my family had lost. Not in money, but in trust. By morning, my phone was flooded with messages. Some were angry, some desperate, some just stunned. Amanda's first text was a string of question marks. Nick sent a one-line email, "Let's talk." Uncle Frank called and left a voicemail sounding both tired and wounded. But I knew the real fallout was only just beginning. At Haven Bridge, I kept my head down. Work became my sanctuary, helping a new mom find safe housing, negotiating with city officials for more funding, writing late-night proposals with Taylor by my side. I let the world believe I was still Justy Allison from the nonprofit, quietly laboring, never drawing attention. But behind the scenes, the Green Family Foundation was moving forward. Marcus and I met nearly every day. We started building a board, selecting community leaders, setting up grants for city education projects and housing programs. I found myself working with old friends of Dad's, people who'd quietly admired his ethics and his refusal to let greed define him. Meanwhile, the wider family chaos was unfolding like a slow-motion car crash. Amanda and Nick's lawyers threatened to contest the trust, but Marcus's legal team was airtight. There was nothing left to fight over, except their own pride. The will they'd pinned all their hopes on controlled almost nothing, just as Marcus had said, a few $1,000s, an old car, some mementos. The rest belonged to the foundation. Still, the pressure mounted. Nick called to say I was destroying the family. Amanda sent a tearful voice message, accusing me of betrayal. Uncle Frank pleaded for just a little understanding, just one more conversation. They all talked about fairness, about what was owed to them. Not once did anyone ask what Dad had actually wanted, or what I'd sacrificed for him. I met with Marcus in his office one evening, the city lights glowing outside. He pushed a cup of tea toward me. They'll eventually have to accept it. But it may take time. I shrugged. They were never really here, Marcus. Not when Dad was sick, not when he needed help. They only showed up when there was something to gain. Marcus smiled sadly. You're not wrong. But I think, deep down, your father always knew you'd be the one to do the hard work. That's why he trusted you. Taylor, my best friend, was the only one I let see the stress. She came over late one night with 2 slices of pie and a bottle of wine. You know, she said, you could have just walked away. You didn't have to keep fighting. I looked at her, suddenly feeling every ounce of exhaustion. I couldn't let him down, Tay. Not after everything. She nodded. That's why he trusted you with everything. Not because you were the oldest, or the smartest, or the loudest, but because you never quit. The days blurred together, long hours at the foundation, late nights at the shelter, barely any sleep. I found myself missing Dad more fiercely than ever. I kept hearing his voice in my head, the last words he whispered before he died. It's yours now, Ali. Make it matter. It wasn't until mid-February, when the first official press release about the Green Family Foundation hit the news, that the outside world began to pay attention. Suddenly, I was getting calls from journalists, city officials, even old professors who'd never given me the time of day before. A Boston Globe reporter asked for an interview. Channel 5 News wanted to run a story on the young woman quietly reshaping her family's legacy. But the most surprising call came from a woman named Lila Porter, a CEO in her 60s, someone I'd admired from afar. She'd started out in nonprofits, too, and now ran a billion-dollar foundation. I heard about what you did, as she said, her voice warm but direct. It takes real courage to defy expectations, and even more to carry out someone's vision against the tide. We met for coffee in the North End. Lila didn't mince words. They're going to resent you for a while. Maybe longer. But you did what had to be done. Don't let their bitterness become your story. For the first time, I saw a possible future that wasn't just about surviving family fallout, but about truly building something new. Still, the bitterness lingered. Nick sent a final email, short and cold, a congratulations. You've won. Hope it was worth it. Amanda stopped responding altogether. It hurt more than I expected. For a few nights, I couldn't sleep, replaying every harsh word, every slight from childhood, every moment I'd spent trying to prove I belonged. Now, with the legacy secured, I wondered if I'd ever have a real family again. And then, slowly, I realized I could create my own. Not from blood, but from people who believed in the same things that had taught me: loyalty, service, and the idea that wealth was a tool, not a trophy. The shockwaves had torn my old life apart. But the rebuilding had finally begun. By early spring, Boston began to thaw. Crocuses poked through the frozen ground in the public garden, and the city seemed to breathe again. For the first time in months, I walked to work without bracing against the wind, letting myself hope, just a little. The Green Family Foundation was taking shape, slowly, quietly, but with real purpose. At Haven Bridge, my daily life remained much the same. I was still organizing meal shifts, running donation drives, and writing reports no one outside the nonprofit world ever read. Most of the city still saw me as the Allison from the shelter, if they noticed me at all. That was fine. I'd learned to move unseen, to let my work speak for itself. But now, word about the foundation was spreading. The press coverage brought attention, some of it skeptical, some of it genuinely curious. One afternoon, while I was eating lunch at my desk, the phone rang. It was the mayor's office. They wanted to discuss a city partnership to expand after-school programs for at-risk kids. Suddenly, doors that had always been closed to me started to open, just a crack. My first board meeting was a blur of nervous energy. I'd brought together a team of people who'd known my father, community organizers, a retired judge, 2 former green tech engineers, and a teacher from Roxbury. Marcus chaired the meeting, but I could feel everyone's eyes on me, waiting to see if I'd sink or swim. I outlined a plan for the Foundation's first year: scholarships, housing grants, a job training initiative for young adults aging out of foster care. The ideas weren't revolutionary, but they were real. For the first time, I saw heads nodding. I saw people taking notes. I saw, maybe, a flicker of respect. After the meeting, Marcus caught up with me outside the conference room. He looked almost proud. "You did well, Alison. They trust you. That's no small thing." I smiled, exhausted but happy. I keep thinking about Dad, how he'd sit in his office late at night, writing checks for scholarships or hiring people nobody else would give a chance. "That's exactly why he picked you," Marcus said gently. "Not because you're ruthless or ambitious, but because you know what it's like to work in the trenches." Meanwhile, the wider family stayed silent. There were no more angry emails, no calls, not even from Uncle Frank. Amanda and Nick seemed to have retreated entirely. At first, their absence stung, but as the Foundation's work took over my life, I started to miss them less. I had new worries, new deadlines, and a growing team that depended on me. Spring rolled on. The first major grant we issued went to a youth tech program in Dorchester. The director, a woman named Sonia, called to say, "This is the first time anyone's believed in us." "Thank you." At the check presentation, a local journalist snapped a photo of me shaking hands with a teenage coder who just won a citywide robotics prize. The article ran with the headline, "A Green Family Foundation Makes First Mark on Boston's Next Generation." I clipped it and taped it to my fridge, next to old snapshots of Dad and me at Red Sox games. Around that time, I started getting invitations to speak at events, business breakfasts, women's leadership panels, even a university lecture series. The first time, I nearly backed out. I hated public speaking. But Taylor cornered me at Haven Bridge, armed with her old debate team pep talk. "You spent years telling other people's stories, Oli. Maybe it's time to tell your own." So I did. I stood up in front of a packed room at the Boston Public Library and talked about growing up in the shadow of green tech, about Dad's belief in second chances, about how invisible work is often the most important kind. When I finished, the applause was real, not polite, but appreciative. People lined up to shake my hand, to offer business cards, to share stories of their own families and struggles. I started to feel something shift inside me. Not pride, exactly, but something like it, a sense that maybe, just maybe, I was finally honoring what Dad had hoped for me. A few weeks later, I got a handwritten letter in the mail. The return address was unfamiliar, but the handwriting was unmistakable, Amanda's. It was a short note, written in blue ink. She apologized for her anger, said she was struggling to understand everything that had happened, and wished me luck with the foundation. There was no invitation to reconnect, but the bitterness was gone. I read the letter 3 times, trying to decide how I felt. Relief, mostly. Gratitude, too. But also a kind of finality, a sense that a door had closed, and that was okay. Nick's silence continued. Uncle Frank, too. But in the space their absence left, something else was growing. A team, a mission, a future. I started running early morning meetings with our new staff, drinking bad coffee and laughing over typos in grant proposals. For the first time in years, I woke up excited to go to work. One night, after a long board meeting, Marcus pulled me aside as we left the building. The city was soft with spring rain, the streetlights reflecting off wet pavement. Your father would be proud, Alison, he said quietly. But I think he'd be even prouder to see how you're doing it, quietly, steadily, building something that will last. I blinked back tears. I just hope I'm getting it right. Marcus smiled. You're not just getting it right. You're making it your own. As I walked home, I felt the first true taste of victory. It wasn't about winning over my family or proving anything to anyone. It was about building something that mattered, for myself and for Boston, a legacy not measured in money, but in hope. Late spring in Boston brought more than just sun and flowers. It brought a sense of possibility I hadn't felt in years. The Green Family Foundation had quietly become a force in the city. I found myself waking up before dawn, excited for whatever the day would bring, and often stayed late into the evening in my office overlooking the Charles River, planning new projects and reading proposals. But the real victory wasn't in the grants or the newspaper stories. It was in the unexpected ripple effects the foundation was having on people's lives. Every week, a new story would reach my desk. A single mom who'd completed her first semester at community college thanks to a scholarship. A veteran who'd landed a job after months of homelessness. A teenager who built a coding app in one of our after-school programs and was now tutoring younger kids. Each time, I remembered Dad's old refrain, money only matters if it does good. The rest is just numbers on a page. Still, the work wasn't easy. Running a foundation meant making tough choices, sometimes saying no to projects I cared about because resources weren't infinite. There were difficult board meetings, disagreements about priorities, moments when I wondered if I was in over my head. But for the first time, I felt like I was growing into myself, becoming the kind of leader that had quietly hoped I'd be. One morning, as I was reviewing a report on housing initiatives, Marcus stopped by my office. He carried a file and wore that look he reserved for serious conversations. There's something you should see, he said, handing me a stack of letters. These came in from the families in our housing program. I started reading. The notes were simple, handwritten thanks, a child's drawing, a parent describing how the grant meant a new start. As I read, the exhaustion of the past months melted away. I realized the real inheritance that had left me was this sense of purpose, of connection to something greater than myself. Meanwhile, the news about the foundation kept circulating. People who'd once looked down on my immodest and non-profit career now reached out for advice, partnerships, or even jobs. I received an email from a former classmate at Harvard, someone who'd barely spoken to me at reunions, asking if there was a place for him on our advisory board. I laughed when I read it. Not because I was vindictive, but because it felt like a full circle, proof that you never really know the value of someone's work until you see what grows from it. But the biggest surprise came one Thursday afternoon. I was meeting with Sonia, the director of the Youth Tech program, when the front desk buzzed. "There's someone here to see you," said the receptionist. "He says it's important." I walked out to the lobby and there stood Nick, my cousin, once so confident, now looking out of place in a wrinkled suit. He hesitated. "Can we talk?" We sat in the tiny staff kitchen, mugs of coffee in hand. Nick stared into his, searching for the right words. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. "For everything. For doubting you. For thinking you weren't up for this." He explained that he tried to contest the trust but soon realized there was no case. At first, he was angry. But watching the foundation grow and seeing the good it was doing had changed something in him. "I spent so long thinking success was about winning, about having the most. I missed what Dad and your dad were trying to teach us. I see that now." The conversation was awkward, raw, but real. By the end, Nick asked if he could volunteer with the job training program. "I need to do something useful," he said. "I want to help, even if it's entry level. I want to start over." For the first time in months, I felt a weight lift off my chest. Not forgiveness, exactly, but a sense that the story wasn't finished. Maybe there was room for a different kind of family, built on effort and second chances, not just old grievances. Word spread. Amanda, too, reached out, first with small questions about the Foundation's work, then later asking for help with a community project she'd started in her neighborhood. Slowly, awkwardly, my cousins began to re-enter my life, not as entitled heirs, but as people learning the value of real work. At a Foundation staff meeting, Taylor joked, "Your family might just turn into do-gooders yet." I grinned. Stranger things have happened. The change didn't erase the past or fix every hurt. But there was something profoundly healing in watching people transform when given a purpose. The Foundation grew, not just in numbers, but in heart. Every new hire, every volunteer, every board member understood that the work wasn't about status or inheritance, but about service. And every time I spoke to a group, students, city leaders, families at a food drive, I finished with the same message: we are more than the sum of our setbacks. True legacy is built on what we give, not what we keep. One evening, as I was leaving the office, I paused to look at the city spread out before me. The lights along the river shimmered, and I felt a quiet certainty settle inside me. This, I realized, was the moral victory I'd been searching for, not just proving myself, but creating something lasting. And in that moment, I understood Dad's greatest gift wasn't the money, or even the business. It was the freedom to choose a different path, to build a life measured not by what I'd inherited, but by what I was willing to give away. Just as I was starting to settle into the new rhythm of my life, the Foundation was thrown its first real curveball. It began as a rumor, murmured in non-profit circles, then appeared in a pointed editorial in the Boston Herald. Should private family foundations wield so much power in shaping city policy? A local councilman publicly questioned our involvement in affordable housing, suggesting favoritism and lack of transparency. The Foundation's rapid impact, what was once our greatest strength, had suddenly become the center of controversy. For the first time, I saw my face on the news, a blurry clip from a community event with a Chiron. A green family legacy, too much influence? Even though I'd always stayed in the background, it was my name they wanted for the story. Marcus called me the morning the story broke. "Stay calm," he advised, his voice calm as ever. "This is part of the work. The more good you do, the more people question your motives. We'll respond with facts, not emotion." But it still stung. For weeks, I'd worked 16-hour days, sacrificing sleep, friendships, even my sense of privacy, only to be painted as an outsider using family money for personal power. There were whispers in meetings, nervous glances from city officials. For a few nights, I lay awake, wondering if maybe Nick and Amanda had been right. Maybe I wasn't strong enough for this. Taylor noticed before anyone else. She found me in my office, late at night, staring blankly at a pile of paperwork. "You're not quitting," she said flatly, perching on the edge of my desk. "You're just scared. And you should be. Big change always pisses people off." I laughed, grateful for her bluntness. "I just don't want to let Dad down. Or ruin what we've started." She shook her head. "Alison, you can't control how people see you. You can only control what you do next." So, I did what Dad would have done. I invited the critics in. We organized an open house at the foundation. We invited council members, journalists, even the people who'd written the harshest articles. For an entire Saturday, we gave tours, answered tough questions, opened our books. We showed them exactly where every dollar was going. It wasn't a magic fix. Some remained skeptical. But the transparency made an impression. Sonia, the director from Dorchester, stood up at the meeting and told the room, "I've never seen this level of accountability in any foundation, big or small. Alison isn't just throwing money around, she's building something that will last." The tide began to turn, slowly. A prominent city official, who'd been silent during the controversy, called me after the open house. "You took the punches and kept going," he said. "That's leadership. Boston needs more of it." But the real support came from places I never expected. Former Green Tech employees reached out to volunteer. A teacher from Dad's old neighborhood sent a note. "Your father would be proud. Not because you're giving, but because you're teaching others to give, too." Even Amanda, who'd avoided the foundation for months, called to say she wanted to start a literacy program in her local school, and asked if I would mentor her through the process. Nick, too, stepped up, quietly handling PR for the job training program, using the skills he'd learned in business school for the good of the foundation. He still struggled with his pride, but he put in the work. I saw him patiently guiding volunteers, helping immigrants with resumes, never asking for attention or thanks. We found a new rhythm, not sisters and cousins fighting over scraps, but colleagues, partners, maybe, one day, friends. Taylor, who'd started as a part-time volunteer, became the foundation's new director of community engagement. She was a natural, a whirlwind of enthusiasm and heart, organizing city-wide days of service, rallying students and retirees, reminding us all why we did this in the first place. Under her leadership, our team doubled in size. For the first time, our staff meetings were filled with laughter and real camaraderie. There were still critics. There always would be. But each challenge made us stronger. And every time I faced doubt, I remembered the first lonely winter, when the only thing I had left was Dad's faith in me. Now, I had a team, a family, in the truest sense, who believed in the work, not the name on the building. One Friday evening, after a long week of interviews and meetings, Marcus joined me on the foundation's roof terrace. The city spread out below us, lights twinkling along the river. "I think you've done it, Alison," he said, raising his coffee in a mock toast. "You've turned a family feud into a city's hope." I smiled, feeling the cool breeze and the weight of the last year fall away. I couldn't have done it alone. He looked at me kindly. "No one ever does." The foundation's first annual gala approached, a symbol not just of our survival but of our impact. For the first time, every seat was filled, not just by donors, but by the people whose lives had been changed, students, parents, formerly homeless families, old friends, and new allies. And in that packed, sparkling room, I finally allowed myself to believe the legacy was safe, the work had only begun, and the victory was no longer just mine. The night of our first annual gala, the grand ballroom at the Charles Hotel buzzed with energy. The city's nonprofits and business leaders mingled with high school scholarship winners and families who'd once stood in line for a warm meal at Haven Bridge. Our board, a quirky mix of retired judges, teachers, engineers, and activists, stood proudly at the entrance, greeting each guest like an old friend. As I moved through the crowd, shaking hands and posing for photos, I felt the sharp ache of nerves. I'd never been comfortable in the spotlight. Dad had hated it too. He always said, "I'll let the work do the talking." But tonight, the work needed a voice. This was my chance to show the city, and maybe even my family, what the Green Family Foundation had become. Taylor found me near the dessert table, beaming. "This is amazing. Ali. You realize what you've done, right? This is more than a foundation. It's a movement." Before I could answer, the band played the first chords of our theme, and Marcus took the stage. He introduced me with warmth, sharing a story about my father's early days in Boston. He built a business from nothing, but he always said his true legacy would be measured by the lives he touched, not the dollars he made. Then, he gestured for me to join him under the bright lights. I stepped to the podium, my notes shaking in my hands. For a moment, the room spun. I thought of Dad, of that last conversation in the hospital, of all the nights spent working late with only hope and stubbornness keeping me going. Then I looked out at the faces, some familiar, some new, and found my voice. I grew up believing that legacies were built in boardrooms. I began, but I've learned that real legacies are built one act of service at a time. Tonight isn't about the Green Family Foundation. It's about every person in this room who dared to hope for something better, for themselves, their families, and this city. I spoke of my father's journey, of his belief in second chances, of the power of invisible work. I thanked the partners, the volunteers, the board, and especially the recipients of our programs, the students, the families, the neighbors who were now helping to shape Boston's future. The applause was thunderous, but it was the moments after the speech that would stay with me forever. One by one, people approached to share their stories. A mother whose son was the first in their family to attend college. A young woman who had once slept in our shelter and was now running a youth leadership program. An older man, a former green tech machinist, who whispered, "Your dad would have been proud, Allison." Late in the evening, as the band played their last song, I saw Nick and Amanda at the edge of the dance floor. For a moment, the old ache returned, the sting of everything we'd lost, the years of silence and misunderstanding. But something in their faces had changed. They looked lighter, more open, as if finally seeing me not as a rival, but as a sister. Nick was the first to approach. "Ali, that was an incredible speech. I'm sorry for everything. I didn't understand. I wanted to win, but you wanted to build." Amanda joined us, her eyes shining. "Can we start over? Not as heirs or competitors. As family. Maybe even friends." It wasn't a perfect reconciliation. We still had work to do, wounds to heal, conversations to have. But in that moment, I felt a quiet peace, a sense that the circle was closing, not ending, but coming around to a new beginning. The next day, we gathered at the family house in Newport. The old place was drafty and cluttered, but it was filled with memories. We cooked breakfast together, pancakes and eggs, laughter echoing through rooms that had once felt heavy with unspoken tension. We talked about the past. We didn't ignore the hurt, but we didn't let it define us either. I shared the letters I'd received from scholarship students and parents, letting Nick and Amanda see firsthand the impact the foundation was having. They listened, truly listened, for the first time in years. By afternoon, the three of us walked down to the water's edge, the Atlantic wind biting but invigorating. Amanda picked up a seashell, holding it to her ear and laughing. Nick skipped a stone across the surf, just like we'd done as kids. Standing there, I realized something. Family wasn't about inheritance or shared DNA. It was about the people who showed up, who stayed, who believed in you when no one else did. It was about forgiveness, about choosing to keep trying, even when it was hard. In the months that followed, Nick became one of the Foundation's most trusted advisors, quietly handling logistics and community outreach. Amanda developed a mentorship program for girls in STEM, inspired by her own rocky journey in the corporate world. We still had our differences, but we were finally building something together. At the end of the summer, as the Foundation celebrated its first year, I stood on the rooftop terrace with Taylor, Marcus, and the rest of our team. The sun was setting over Boston, painting the skyline gold. Taylor raised a glass. To legacies, and to the people who have the courage to build them right. And for the first time, I truly felt it. The work wasn't finished, but the old wounds were healing. The future was open, bright, and full of possibility. A year after that first turbulent family meeting, the Green Family Foundation had become more than I'd ever imagined. We celebrated the anniversary with an outdoor block party, not a formal gala, a decision our board insisted on. Kids raced each other down the sidewalks in the late summer sun, parents chatted over lemonade and barbecue, and a jazz band played beneath the spreading branches of an old maple tree. There was laughter, music, and the easy joy that only comes when people feel truly at home. Looking around, I realized how much had changed, not just for me, but for all of us. The faces in the crowd were a blend of old friends and new, the volunteers from Haven Bridge, former green tech workers who'd become Foundation partners, teachers, city leaders, and the very families we aimed to serve. There were even a few faces from those early, difficult days, journalists who doubted us, officials who'd once kept their distance, now relaxed and smiling as they watched their kids line up for face paint or balloon animals. At the heart of it all, my family. Nick was working the grill, showing a group of teens how to flip burgers with the same precision he once brought to spreadsheets. Amanda was laughing with a table of girls from her mentorship program, their voices bright with excitement about science projects and summer internships. Uncle Frank, who had once called me naive, was quietly refilling water pitchers, occasionally sharing stories of Dad's stubborn optimism with anyone who'd listen. Taylor, ever the spark in our engine, darted from tent to tent making sure everything ran smoothly, her phone buzzing with texts and reminders but her eyes always alert for someone who needed a hand or a joke to break the tension. And Marcus, wise and steady as always, lingered at the edge of the crowd, taking it all in. He caught my eye and gave me a small nod, as if to say, "See? This is what you built." Yet, I knew it wasn't just me. If this journey had taught me anything, it was that legacies aren't solo projects. They're mosaics built from hundreds of hands, small kindnesses, and second chances. When the music paused for announcements, the crowd gathered by the makeshift stage. I felt a familiar flutter of nerves as Taylor pressed the microphone into my hand. I spoke simply, from the heart. 1 year ago, I stood before you wondering if we could really change anything. Tonight, looking at all of you, I know the answer is yes, but not because of any one person. because we did this together. I thanked the partners, the staff, and especially the families, the single dads, the new immigrants, the resilient kids who'd found a place to thrive. I thanked my siblings, who'd found their own way to serve, and I honored my father, who had started it all with a simple belief that every life mattered, and every person deserved a chance. As the crowd applauded, I thought about the journey here, the pain of exclusion, the lonely months of silent work, the moment of decision when I'd chosen to put everything on the line for a different kind of future. I remembered the anger, the exhaustion, the fear that I might never be enough. But most of all, I remembered the spark that carried me through, Dad's trust, and the certainty that service was the only legacy worth fighting for. After the speeches, the party continued late into the evening. The streetlights came on, kids ran through sprinklers in the park, and old friends reminisced about days gone by. Amanda and Nick found me by the lemonade stand. Amanda squeezed my shoulder, her eyes shining with pride. "Look at all this, Oli. This is what a real inheritance looks like." Nick smiled. "We might not have gotten the company or the big house, but we gained something better. Purpose. Family. A second chance." We stood together, watching the celebration unfold, not as heirs to a fortune, but as stewards of something far more precious. In the months that followed, the foundation expanded. We built partnerships with schools, launched new initiatives for veterans, and supported small businesses across the city. We weathered setbacks, celebrated victories, and never lost sight of our mission. Sometimes, when doubt crept in, I'd reread the letters from students and parents, reminders that the work was making a real difference. Taylor and I would often meet on the rooftop at sunset, surveying the city we'd come to love. Sometimes we'd talk about the future, sometimes about Dad, sometimes just about the ordinary joys of another good day. I realized, in those quiet moments, that I had found not only my father's legacy but my own. I'd learned that courage wasn't about never being afraid, but about moving forward even when you are. That forgiveness is a process, not a finish line. And that family, by blood or by choice, is built every day in small acts of trust and generosity. On the anniversary of Dad's passing, we gathered as a family on the old porch in Newport. We shared stories, laughter, even a few tears. Amanda presented a framed collection of photos from the past year, kids graduating, families moving into new homes, volunteers grinning at our block party. In the center was a single snapshot of Dad, beaming in his Red Sox cap, arms slung around the three of us. As the sun set over the Atlantic, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. We had made mistakes, suffered losses, fought old battles, but would find our way back to each other, and to the kind of legacy that could never be measured in dollars or deeds alone. And as I looked out at the faces I loved, I understood, finally, what Dad had meant. Legacies aren't about what you leave behind. They're about what you build together, one day, one act of kindness at a time.